Hey folks, in this tutorial I'm going to show you a fun Photoshop technique for adding creative light to an image that can give it more dimension, drama, and visual interest. Now it does involve adding the appearance of light that wasn't actually in the scene, so if you're a strict documentary style photographer, this may not be the technique for you. But for those of us who enjoy working in a more artistic and painterly approach, it can be a lot of fun. This technique was developed and shown to me by my friend Christoper Briscoe. Chris is an incredible portrait photographer and writer who has a long career of photographing people from all walks of life. Like myself, Chris was a school teacher and later moved to photography. Unlike me, his landscapes are faces. Make sure to check out the links to Chris's work that I've included in the video description. I've decided to call this technique Briscoe Light in honor of Chris. Chris has a lot of experience working in a studio with studio lighting, but in the past several years he's been doing a lot of work with a more journalistic, street-based approach, shooting outside the studio and using the available light. He started developing his Briscoe Light technique to try to bring some of that studio control and drama to his available light images. The effect can be subtle or dramatic and can even work in conjunction with the natural lighting. As you can see, Chris has been really successful using it in his portrait work. I want to see if it can also be used successfully with landscape photographs. I found it works best with images that are already a bit dark or underexposed like this one. And if you're starting with a more brightly exposed image like this one, then I would suggest making an exposure adjustment layer and bringing down the exposure and working with the gamma and the offset to get the right amount of contrast. Or you could simply just make a curves adjustment layer and drag down the curve. Whether you're starting with a brighter image that you've decreased the exposure in Photoshop, or you're starting with an image like this that already is darker, the next step is to add a new layer, which can be done with this button in the Layers panel or here in the TKActions panel. And now we're going to fill that layer with black, either by going to Edit, Fill, or just going to the Fill button here in the TKActions panel, selecting black, and then clicking OK. This layer will act as the template for the light pattern that you're going to add to the image. There are many different ways you could create your light on this layer depending on if you want dappled light, rays of light, spotlight, window light, or something else. In this tutorial I'll show you how to do dappled light and rays of light, but you can do a lot of experimenting on your own and add your own personalized look. For dappled light, I'm going to start by lowering the opacity of the black layer to 50%. And then using the regular Lasso tool to draw everywhere I would like kind of a pool of light. So I'm going to add light to a lot of these kind of hummocks in the grass here. So that's why I'm selecting all of those kind of separately in here. And on your own you can take lots of time to kind of establish this in just the way you like and be very careful. But you actually don't have to be that careful because they're going to be blurred later. I also want to add light to these trees and branches, so I'm going to select some of those, and maybe this whole tree back here, and maybe one more area in there. And sorry, one more area there. Now I'm going to fill inside this selection with white. So I could either go to Edit and Fill, just like we said before, or I can just come to the TKActions panel, click the Fill button, and instead of black, we'll select white and click OK. Now I'll deselect the selection and return the opacity back to 100%. And there's our Dappled Light template. Now I want to get that template loaded into the Channels panel. If you have the TKActions V5 panel, in the Rapid Mask 2 module, you can just click on the Composite button, and this will create a Rapid Mask layer that is the template you made. If you don't have the TKActions panel, the way to get that loaded as a layer in the channels panel is to hold down the control or the command key and click on the RGB layer to reload that as a selection, and then click the add channel or save channel button, and that will then save that as its own separate alpha channel. Now I can deselect that selection if I have one, and I can also turn off this black and white layer. The next step is going to be to create a curves adjustment layer with that channel as the mask on the curves adjustment layer. With the panel and the rapid mask channel in place, I would just go to the layer button and then select curves. And that curves adjustment layer will be created, and that mask will automatically be applied. Without the panel, I would go to the alpha channel I made and hold down the control or command key and click on that to load the selection. And then in the layers panel, I would go to curves, and that'll also come with that mask attached. Now I'm going to pull this properties panel out here onto the image so that I can see it better. And I'm going to use the targeted adjustment tool now to make an adjustment to the curve. So I'm going to find some of these brighter areas of grasses and click and drag up on those quite a ways. And in some of the darker areas down in those grasses, to keep the contrast that I want, I'm going to click and drag down just slightly. And you can see our pools of light are coming into being, but they're still hard edged, so they're very obvious and apparent. We want to blur that mask so that those edges will blend and smooth out and look more natural. Without the panel, you would need to select the mask and then go to Filter, Blur, and select Gaussian Blur and add a blur to that mask. But with the panel, in the Rapid Mask 2 module, you can click the Layer Mask mode and now modify that mask in real time using these buttons in the Modify section. So if I wanted to blur the mask with the Gaussian Blur, I would just click on Blur, and this would enable me to blur out those edges, and you can see it looks quite a bit better already. So I'm going to say OK. And I could further modify that mask by, for example, maybe opening up a levels adjustment layer and working with the levels to maybe brighten the bright areas in the mask, and then also work with the feathering of that mask a bit with the highlights and shadows slider, and looking for something that looks like a good natural transition, and then click OK. And just this layer alone has done a great job of adding that Briscoe Light effect, and you can see that really brings out the dimension and some drama and visual interest. To further work with this effect, I'm going to add a selective color adjustment layer. From the layers panel, I can come down here and go to selective color, and then I'm going to go to the neutrals and bring up the yellows and bring up the reds, or turn down the cyans, and just add a little more warmth into those areas. And I could also work with the black slider a little bit and decide, maybe where I want to dial that in. And when I've got that done, I'm now going to come down to this mask and hold down the Alt or the Option key, and then click and drag that mask onto that selective color layer. So now I've got the mask on both layers, and that's just adding a little bit of extra warmth into those pools of light. Of course, if I wanted to further work with that mask, I could select the mask, select a white paintbrush, and make sure that I have a very soft edged brush, and then I could come in here and further mask in areas where I wanted more light, even if I wanted to maybe create some sort of a kind of a bright, that's probably more than I want to go. Let's bring that down to about 30%, and if I wanted to increase or add some streaks of light into the sky, I could do that as well. And if I wanted to also add that warming color to that, I could hold down the Alt or the Option key again and click and drag that up. So now replace that again. So those two masks are the same. And finally, I would select both of those layers, and either using this button in the Layers panel or this button in the TKActions panel, add those to a group. So there they are. I would call this group my Dappled Light. And that way I can further work with the opacity to dial in just the amount of that effect that I want, that I think looks good. And I could also come back in and further work with the curve if I wanted to fine tune and adjust the effect of that lighting, and I could work with the selective color if I wanted to do that. But anyway, as you can see, there's a great example of adding dappled light using the Briscoe Light method. Now let's look at how to add rays of light instead of dappled light. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse that dappled light group and turn off the visibility of that, so we're starting again from the beginning. Just like before, I'm going to add a new layer either here in the TKActions panel or down here in the Layers panel, and I'll fill with black here in the TK panel, and up here under Edit, Fill in the menu, and I'll lower the opacity of that black layer again just like before. And this time I'm going to choose a white brush and bring it down a little bit, but keep it fairly soft edged, but bring up the opacity of the brush to 100%. And now I just want to add some spots of white to that black layer where I think that I would like my rays of light to go. So I think I want some rays of light to kind of come through the sky up here, and I want them to come down here into the landscape, and they're going to be radiating from this corner of the image and then down through. So I'm just imagining these dots being kind of where these rays are going to come through, and I'm going to work with this quite a bit, but that's just my starting point. So now I will increase the opacity of that layer back up, and now I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. And I'm going to select the zoom style of blur. I'm going to bring up the amount to 100%, and I'm going to move the blur, central blur point up to that upper corner where I want my rays of light to be coming from. And I'll say OK. And there's my initial blur. Now we're not done yet. That's just a start. So I can see I've got kind of a gap here where I want to have more light. So I'm going to add another couple of dots in there. And to all of these that I want to become more significant blurs, I'm just going to add more spots of white to these so that that blur will increase through all this area. Maybe I want to add one here as well. Okay, so once I have that done, I'm going to blur again. And if I go up to the filter menu, I could go down and go to blur, radial blur again. But if I know I'm going to use all the exact same settings, I can just do radial blur, and it'll be the exact same blur as what I did before by using this keyboard shortcut Alt Control F or Option Command F on a Mac. So I'll do that from here on out. So there's one. So Control Alt or Command Option and F to do it again. And one more time to keep that blur going. And I'm going to add in some more spots of white one more time, just to get these blur lines really well defined. And Control Alt or Command Option and F. And one more time. And I think even one more time to make sure I've got nice smooth rays coming across my image. Okay, now I want to save that. If I have the Rapid Mask 2 module, I can just click the Composite button, And that will now update the rapid mask layer to match that. So I've got that in there. That's great. And if I don't have that method of adding that, I would hold down Control or Command and click on the RGB layer to load the selection. And then I would click on this button to save it as an alpha channel. And there it is. And now I'll turn off that black layer so we don't have the visibility of it. And just like before, I'll add those light rays as a mask to a curves adjustment layer. Now, if I have my selection that I use to make that alpha channel, I could actually just go straight to here and make my curves adjustment layer, and it would automatically make that with the mask. Or I can deselect, and if I hadn't used that, if I had been using the panel, I've already got the rapid mask, so all I need to do is go to Layer and say Curves. And there's my curves with that mask. And also, just like before, I can adjust the curve by using the targeted adjustment tool, and I'll probably do something similar. Find some light areas in the grass to draw the curve up, and maybe darker area to add contrast, and decide where I want that to be. And then I want to do some modifications to this mask. In this case, it's already feathered or blurred pretty well. So I just want to increase the contrast. I want to actually make those ray areas whiter or brighter in the mask. So I could either click on the mask and go to Image, Adjustments, and select either levels or curves and adjust it there. Or if I'm using the Rapid Mask 2 panel, I can just go to the Layer Mask mode and come down here to Levels or Curves. We'll go with Levels, and I can adjust that mask right from here. So increasing the white area of the mask to really let those rays come through, and then I can adjust this to kind of work with the feathering. And I could also further blur if I want to add more blur to the mask, and maybe 200 pixels is too much, so let's bring it down to 100. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, now you can see my light rays coming through that image. And again, if I wanted to warm up those light rays, kind of make that light in the bright areas a little warmer, I could add another selective color adjustment, and again bring up the yellows, bring up the reds, and then Alt or Option click on the mask and drag it to add it there so that it's only affecting what's inside those light rays. And then again, select both layers and either clicking here or here, adding it to a group, which I'll call light rays. And again, adjust the opacity to get the effect just where I want it, and also being able to go back in and fine tune any of those layers. So there's my light ray effect, and here is my dappled light effect. Now, Chris has found that many of the light patterns that he creates can be useful for use in other images. So he saves those light patterns for future use in his Creative Cloud library. If you use the Creative Cloud version of Photoshop, here's how that works. You'd start by opening your Creative Cloud library on your workspace if it's out there. And if it's not, you find it by going to Window, Libraries. And you can see here's my library of other light patterns that I've created over time. Now I just name mine with numbers, so far I'm up to 13. So all I would need to do is go to these layers if I wanted to save them in my library, click on it, and actually I need to turn on the visibility, and then I'm going to rename it. So this would be number 14, and then this one, if I want to save this one would be number 15. And then all I do is just click and drag. I'll start with number 14 and click and drag it into my library. And it adds it. And again, this one, I'll click and drag and add it. And there it is. So now, anytime in the future, if I want to use any of those light patterns in a different image, all I have to do is just find a light pattern that I want to use, and then just click and drag it out as the top layer of the image. And if I need to stretch it to fit, or if I want to rotate it and stretch it, so if I want to get it situated to more fit this particular image, you can do that. And then when you're done, click the check mark to set that. And then at this point, we're back to the place where we were before. And I would continue by adding this layer to the channels panel, either with the rapid mask panel or by making a selection of it and saving it. And from then on, it's the same as what we've done before. So that's the Briscoe Light technique. I give my thanks to Chris for being so generous to share it with us. Hope you'll give it a try and let us know how it goes. And also let us know if you find any cool additions or modifications to this technique that you'd like to share with us. So thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe to this channel so you can keep current with my latest tutorials and my adventures in photography.